engage the novel to talk about the Biafran War and the role of the intellectual in that war. So in a sense, it's as if that he was not satisfied to package his thoughts in one theoretical form, but actually to use different formats of packaging. And therefore, for me, the documentary, the triple heritage, I think, and the Africans really, is such a powerful way of communicating Africa. And that is why it received huge backlash amongst especially some scholars on the continent as well as in Europe, because of the very radical, if you want, position that he took in telling the African story.
Yeah, and we still have those kind of scholars, Professor Wanjala, that will put out a message, will put out their thoughts and resonate and impact not only the country, but the continent and the world at large.
Yes, we do. That's why Mazrui was rated as one of the top 100 scholars from Africa. I think in Zimbabwe, during the book fair, he was one of those called public intellectuals. Public intellectuals are people who, with comfort, move out of their seminar room and lecture hall and perform beyond the seminar room and actually engage with more publics than just the academia, giving lecture to students and marking essays, things like that. Mazrui went beyond that. And you know, Mazrui came from a tradition of writers. He came from a tradition where his own father was a pamphleteer, somebody who wrote documents. So there is a way in which he's unique. He came from a tradition of writing, so that when he went to school, it was really just to reinforce a tradition which was already established in a family which had a library, which was writing, and which was engaging in ideas. So we may argue that there are scholars like him. Of course, Professor Mnena has mentioned Walter Rodney. There is Mudimbe of the Congo and the DRC. Mudimbe is more or less engaging at that level, but Mazrui still supersedes most of those scholars.
Do we see more coming up, or is it just that generation, the Achebes that we're talking about, in terms of that space still having more people coming into it? And we had that discussion earlier, and as far as after this generation is gone, then what happens to that space?
There is no need to despair. There's somebody who will always come up at the right time with the right qualities, and that person will be recognized for being that. Mazrui was unique in his own way. He was unique not only in Africa but in the world. I guess that's why when he was being rated among the top world intellectuals, not just African, world intellectuals, it was a recognition. And those unique people are rare, not just in Africa, everywhere, but they do come up. We have a lot of young people who are doing their best and they are writing good things and things like that, but it will take time before they can be seen and be recognized to be the force that they are. Some people are lucky that they become recognized as a force almost immediately because of the punch they have. And Mazrui had a punch, and he continued to have a punch almost to his last days. At every decade, you can say, Mazrui did that. At every decade, he did that. At every decade. So he had that uniqueness. Other people who in Africa who have that, I mean, Wole Soyinka has something close to that. Ngoge has something like that. John Beatty, I think he has retired. But at that time he did. So what I'm saying is that there will be people. It's just difficult to say that you can say it is so and so now until we see it. They'll be there.
So you're saying it develops with time, Professor, that
develops
this sort of like marinates up until older age, perhaps?
Absolutely. I mean, he has written since 1962. So 50 years of writing, is substantial. And I would imagine that the younger scholars, and we do have a good number of younger scholars, we will be able to appreciate them in a few years. I think that I am very hopeful that they are there. I also would like to say that the fact that he wrote from the United States has also helped significantly, because there are certain facilities available in Western academia which are not available in African academia, in terms of research grants, in terms of research assistance, books and facilities and salaries and so on.
Okay, and let me bring you in, Professor Chris Wanjala, on the fact that even one of the articles today, just paying tribute to him and talking about how controversial he was, Professor Ochieng, one of the people that he'd get into a lot of back and forth with. And we saw that a lot also with Professor Bethwell Ogot, where there'd be these intellectual conversations going on between these scholars on matters that are happening across the country, across the continent and the world. But we don't see a lot of that happening now. We see some people penning down a few articles here and there, but that discourse in terms of the important issues and having an intellectual conversation is not happening.
One thing is the temperament of Mazrui was thoroughly intellectual. Although he engaged in debates, he did not only debate with fellow scholars, he debated with politicians. I mean, he could take on Milton Obote and they have a debate.
Yes.
Ken Adoko and so on. He could have a debate with them. And indeed, Walter Rodney, at one time, they held a debate. So there is a way in which Mazrui defined an intellectual as a person who is fascinated by ideas and can handle them effectively. And so he grew up as a public scholar. His own study was of the DRC Congo, which was actually talking about peace in the Congo. So the issues that he took were public issues.
So Professor Wanjala, why don't we see that now? Because especially now at a time where political temperatures heightened in the country, there's a lot of politicking left, right and center. You get a sense that you need some sanity and instilled by perhaps a voice of reason, but we're not getting that.
Yes.
Why is that?
You are right to say that there is a way in which local, by local I mean people who are operating from Kenya, have not been very, very forthright. One could remember William Ochieng, who only challenged Mazrui to a public kind of forum, and when Mazrui accepted, he chickened out. So there is a way in which, as Professor Njogu has said, Mazrui operated on what he called Olympian heights. For him, America was like the Olympian heights, and he could talk to the world from that global scene. But the intellectuals who have been operating from the local scene have been, so to speak, sort of incapacitated by censorship, harassment, torture, to the extent that people had just to hide their manuscripts under their tables. And indeed, Mazrui himself had to leave Uganda because he couldn't survive in a means regime.
But Professor Munene, hasn't that changed? Hasn't the space opened up? There's more space to freely perhaps express oneself?
Yes, there is freedom to express oneself, not just for the intellectuals, but the entire country.
Correct.
There's no question about that. The facilities for expressing self are not there. And we do have, unfortunately, a trend, particularly in Africa, and Kenya is involved in that, where university education and university undertaking has been going downwards instead of going up. You rarely find lecturers in their offices thinking, because one of the main things they're supposed to do is to think, even if what they're thinking is something else, but they're supposed to be thinking and then raising questions. Now, when they are starving, they cannot be thinking. And one of the main arguments is that the libraries, the universities are not as accommodating as they were in the 1970s and 60s and even part of the 1980s. They are not. You have situations where people are crying about the quality of the university education. Employers are complaining that we are producing half-baked graduates. Why? Because the environment, the intellectual, academic environment at the universities is not what it should be. And therefore, it is kind of too much to expect people who feel suppressed to be able to produce weight. And that's why we keep on inviting experts from outside. When we have our own experts here, we don't pay attention to them. We pay attention to somebody else because they have better facility, they have everything. So I think there is a willingness to engage. And that to KTN, at least this is part of the engagement. Eh?
Yes.
It's also,
Do you agree, Professor?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that ideas thrive best in an environment in which people are reading, people are researching, and people are not struggling over very basic things like food and rent and so on. But if you look at the state of our universities at the moment, where ideas are supposed to be generated, there's such a huge commercialization of university education, such that lecturers and professors are running up and down, teaching too many students. And therefore, you cannot have time to reflect and to write and to engage globally and to be able to do research to provide informed analysis. And I think this is really something that we should all be ashamed of as a country, really. I think that to grow a new generation of scholars, a new generation of leadership, intellectual leadership, we require an enabling environment. In the United States, there is no professor that does not have a team of researchers working under them. There is no professor who does not have a team of teaching assistants taking care of marking and tutorials and so forth. In our case, actually, we don't have this type of facilitation. So I think that it's an issue of facilitation as well as the environment. It's not that we have a paucity, an absence of intellectual rigor in the country. We do have that rigor. Most of us are educated in the Western tradition. We understand those ideas. We are able to engage globally as well as locally, but the environment in which we work...
So you're saying you're too stretched?
Too stretched to be able to engage as rigorously as we would like to engage.
All right, before I come to you, Professor Anjala, let's listen to one Professor Tanga Odoye, who's a professor at the Makerere University, where, of course, Professor Mazrui taught for many years. This is what he had to say.
It's unfortunate that the world, Africa and Uganda at this critical stage has lost Ali Mazrui, Professor of Political Science. I think Ali Mazrui is one of the few international scholars who have been heralded across ideological boundaries, across continents and political divide. One, for the simple reason that Ali Mazrui is a scholarly work. His critique of government does not have boundaries, does not have a government at any one time which could pay him money for him to drum support for that government. So he laid a foundation of scholarly work which will be contested but may not be equaled for the years after him. So I see Ali Mazrui first as a scholar in Makerere, a person who held scholarly work in Makerere, both writing and teaching, at a very difficult time. Any person of intellectual type of Mazrui who was here during their mean time and criticized the system from within was first of all under difficult threat. Now Ali Mazrui did that from within and did that from without, and he did not mind. He actually cared more to meet the person or the government and the leader he criticized. He would even say he wants to meet Amin, even when he has criticized him. And that's very rare with the political critics. Now the second is that Ali Mazrui internationally is known as a critic of bad governance. Whether that governance is US, whether it is Britain, whether it is Africa, whether it is Uganda, Ali Mazrui would position himself to criticize that government. At the height of the Cold War, he was very critical of capitalism and how capitalism got embedded into African states without Africans knowing that capitalism was going to consume them. And I find most of his writings, most of his criticism on capitalism, very on spot.
Professor Tanga Odoi there from the Makerere University in Uganda on how he remembers the late Professor Mazrui and the impact that mark that he's left in the world today. Professor Wanjala, coming back to you, seeing that the final stages of his life he spent away abroad and highly recognized there, appreciated, honored, and as well as leaving a mark there too. You have the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the same. So what is it one would wonder about Kenya that we see these great minds, brilliant stars head out of the country and continue with their work out there? Is there a lack of an appreciation here, or is it that space you're talking about that there isn't sufficient and there isn't that appreciation here as well?
Well, one thing about Mazrui, just as we have heard from our Makerere colleague, is that he was not the concept of the alienated scholar, a scholar who works from the fringe of society. He could take on issues like at the beginning of his career, he wrote so much about Kwame Nkrumah, calling him all sorts of, giving him all sorts of titles. If you look at the back issues of transition, he's engaging with those politicians. There's a way in which he interacted with them on an equal basis, not from the basis of being a lesser mortal because he's an intellectual. So there is a way in which he enjoyed some familiarity with those leaders, so that when it came to writing, however passionate, however critical he was of them, he still integrated with them, and they recognized him. But of course, there are scholars who sort of operate on the margin of government. Like Nketia in Ghana, the musicologist, he did his research, but worked with the government. So there is a way in which he was integrated. I know that Mazrui's personality contributed so much to the way he operated. Now, of course, we have had Ngugi and other scholars who have been critical, who have also taken up, a critical stance vis-a-vis the government. But you see, there is a way in which Ngugi is, a wholesale socialist literary critic, to the extent that, in fact, governments feel nervous about him. But Mazrui had a way of balancing the act. He could criticize and then give some objective, he would balance, so that when he's talking about Amin was more or less a soldier, but he could see some merit in Amin. So that kind of liberalism of Mazrui gave him that stature where he could not be completely ostracized or, rejected by politicians.
Professor Mnene, so what is it then, back to the question of what the environment is back here? Because even the Bible says a prophet perhaps is never much appreciated at home. So is it the case we are seeing that with these excellent minds that they find with their work, this is perhaps not where they're able to exercise it to the fullest, and it is received the way perhaps they'd want that kind of feedback?
Let me digress a little bit. I think both Mazrui and Ngugi received their accolades in East Africa before they went out.
Okay.
We read Ngugi when we were in high school, and we also heard of Mazrui when we were there, and they were operating in East Africa and they had made their name. The attraction they got from outside was because of what they had done here. Mazrui talks about when he was running away from Uganda, then there was a problem in Nairobi. He wanted to come to the University of Nairobi, and the University of Nairobi was not accommodating. So in that sense, Kenya was not willing to accept this person. And that's why he went out and stayed out. Ngugi, the same story. He was here until he went into detention. And when he came out, again, we did not accommodate him. So he had to go. These people were forced outside by the environment of the day, mainly because of their whatever it is that they had done. And they are not the only ones. There are other people who feel that they are not simply appreciated, but actually they are not acceptable. And I hope that has changed to the point where people feel they are not acceptable, and they have to go because they are not acceptable politically and socially or whatever it is. But I think that should change. But those people left because of those circumstances. There are others who have left because of what you are saying. The environment is just not conducive. Poor pay and working environment, overcrowded classrooms, and underhanded whatever it is. All those things are real.
Yeah.
And so people say, then we cannot expect these people to produce. Writing books, as Chris will say here, and Kimani here, is a tedious thing. It requires a lot of thinking.
A lot, okay.
And the environment is just not that conducive.
Not very conducive. Gentlemen, we'll take a short break and come back and talk about Professor Mazrui, the late, who's a strong Pan-Africanist, and the role of Africa, especially in global politics. We recently had that US-Africa Leaders Summit. What does that say in terms of changing that landscape, if at all any change? And also now we're talking about referendum in the country. He was involved in, he was consulted on constitutional matters, changing of constitutions. What would he say to this push that we're seeing in the country? We'll talk about that and more when we return after this break.